The morning after the worst night of the season, a neighbor walked across the frozen field to check on the widow's cabin. He expected the worst. The cold had been savage, well below zero, winds cutting across the open ridge, the kind of night that turned water to ice inside a closed room. 3 families in the settlement had burned through their entire nights with supply just to keep their stoves alive until dawn. One man had fed his last share into the firebox before sunrise. But when the neighbor reached her door and knocked, no answer. He pushed it open, bracing himself. The air inside was warm. Not the residual, fading warmth of embers still cooling. Warm, as if a fire had burned an hour ago. As if the room itself had decided not to surrender to the night. There was no fire. The stove was cold to the touch. She was asleep, wrapped in a single blanket, completely still. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking around the room. The walls, the low light. Something felt wrong, or maybe right, in a way he couldn't name. Something was different about this room. He just couldn't tell what. He told the story at the trading post 2 days later. The men listened. Then they laughed. She got lucky, one said. The wind broke early. But the wind hadn't broken early. And luck doesn't hold stone. If you've ever wondered why some old cabin stayed warm without burning half a cord of wood overnight, and why that knowledge nearly disappeared, stay with us. The answer is inside these walls. Her name was Margaret Cole then, or so local oral accounts from the upper Tennessee River Valley region suggest, though the spelling varies across the few surviving settlement records of the 1870s. What those records do agree on is the outline of her situation. A woman alone on a 40-acre parcel, a cabin built by hands now gone, and a winter coming that no one in the valley felt good about. She had been widowed 2 seasons prior. The cabin was sound enough, hewn log walls, a single room layout roughly 16 by 18 feet, a stone fireplace on the north wall that drew adequately when the wind cooperated. But adequately was not the same as warmly. The first winter alone, she had burned through nearly 4 full cords of split oak before February ended. That was not a small number for one person. It was, by most accounts in the settlement, a cord more than a family of 4 typically needed for the same stretch of cold. She had worked harder than her neighbors to stay less warm. That fact settled into her like the cold itself. The following spring, while the ground was still soft from snow melt, she began making trips to the river. Not for water, not for fishing. She was loading stone into a hand-pulled cart, flat, dark, heavy slabs of river slate, some of them 2 to 3 inches thick, most of them 12 to 18 inches across. Trip after trip, week after week. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Elias Boone, watched from his fence line one afternoon and finally walked over to ask what she was building. She told him she wasn't building anything. She was changing something. He asked what needed changing. She said, the way the heat leaves. Boone didn't know what to make of that. He told his wife that evening that Margaret Cole then had gone peculiar with grief. His wife reportedly said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The stone kept coming. By early summer, the pile beside her cabin door had grown to nearly 800 pounds, a rough estimate based on the number of cart loads described in a neighbor's diary entry from that period. Margaret wasn't stacking it outside for long. One by one, the slabs began disappearing into the cabin, and yet from the outside, nothing looked different. The cabin looked exactly as it always had. No new walls, no addition, no obvious change to the structure. That invisibility was not an accident. It was the whole point. What Margaret understood, intuitively, through 2 winters of paying close attention to how her cabin lost and held heat, was that the problem was never the fire itself. The fire worked fine. The problem was the room. The walls were storing almost nothing. Log and chinking had a certain insulating value, yes, but what is a poor vessel for heat? It does not hold warmth the way stone does. It does not release it slowly through a long, dark night. When the fire died, the room died with it. The logs gave nothing back. She intended to fix that. Not with more wood. With the right kind of stone, placed in the right positions, absorbing the fire's heat during the burning hours, and returning it slowly and steadily during the hours the fire could not burn. It was in every essential way the logic of a battery. She had never heard that word used in that context. She didn't need to. The river had given her the material. The 2 cold winters had given her the question. What she built that summer was the answer. The community, for its part, continued to find the whole enterprise amusing. A woman hauling Slate into her own living room, leaning rocks against the walls like she was decorating a cave. The laughter was not malicious. It was the laughter of people who had never had a reason to question the way their own cabins worked. They burned wood. The cabin warmed. The fire died. The cabin cooled. That was the cycle. That was simply how it was. They would not laugh past January. Not all stone is equal. That is a fact that builders, masons, and geologists have understood for centuries. But it is also a fact that a careful observer can arrive at through nothing more than touch, weight, and attention. Margaret Cole then arrived at it through all three. The river near her property ran over a bed of sedimentary rock that included significant deposits of dark phyllite and chlorite schist, materials commonly grouped under the broad regional term river slate by settlers of the period, though technically distinct from true metamorphic slate quarried in the Northeast. The distinction matters less than the shared properties. These rocks were dense, fine-grained, and dark in color. They had been shaped by water into flat, manageable slabs, and they had a thermal characteristic that Margaret could feel even before she understood it in any formal sense. When she left a piece of this stone near the fire for an hour and then moved it away, it stayed warm far longer than she expected. Not just warm to the touch, warm in a way that radiated outward, that she could feel on the back of her hand from several inches away. She noted this. She tested it again. The behavior was consistent. What she was observing is what physicists would later formalize as specific heat capacity, the amount of energy a material can store per unit of weight before its temperature rises. Dense, dark stone, particularly the kind of fine-grained sedimentary and low-grade metamorphic rock she was collecting, has a specific heat capacity roughly 2 to 3 times higher than an equivalent weight of dry firewood or common softwood lumber. In practical terms, the same amount of fire energy that heats a log quickly and releases that heat quickly will instead be absorbed slowly by stone, stored for hours, and released back into the room at a gradual, steady rate long after the fire has gone cold. This is not magic. It is physics, and it was available to anyone willing to carry heavy rocks uphill from a river. Margaret was also selective in ways that went beyond weight and density. She consistently chose dark-colored stone over light. This, too, had a basis in physical reality she was working out empirically rather than theoretically. Darker materials absorb radiant energy more efficiently than pale ones. A pale limestone or white quartz will reflect a portion of the fire's radiant heat back into the room immediately. Useful in the moment, but not stored. A dark slate absorbs that radiation into its mass, converting it to thermal energy held within the stone itself. She also rejected any piece that rang hollow when tapped with another stone, any slab with visible cracks running through it, and anything that felt powdery or friable at the edges. Cracked or porous stone would absorb moisture from the cabin's air during humid months and then risk spalling, small explosive fractures, when rapid heating drove that moisture out as steam. She had seen it happen in a neighbor's hearth. She wanted no part of it. What she brought home, trip after trip through that spring and early summer, was dense, solid, dark, uncracked river slate. Pieces averaging between 15 and 25 pounds each, flat enough to stack or lean, thick enough to carry meaningful thermal mass without cracking under repeated heat cycles. By the end of June, she had accumulated somewhere between 35 and 45 individual pieces. The total weight, based on the estimated average, would have been somewhere in the range of 600 to 900 pounds of thermal mass, all of it selected, carried, and transported by one woman without mechanical assistance. Elias Boone watched another cartload arrive one afternoon and shook his head slowly. He had decided, by this point, that it was not grief that drove her. It was something else. He couldn't name it, but it bothered him more than grief would have. His wife, watching from the window, said, "She's thinking. Let her think." Word travels fast in a small settlement. By midsummer, most of the families within 2 miles of Margaret Colvin's cabin had heard some version of what she was doing. The stories had the loose, exaggerated quality that distance and retelling always adds. Some accounts said she was stacking stone floor to ceiling. Others claimed she'd torn out the fireplace entirely and replaced it with a pile of river rock. One version, apparently circulating by August, held that she intended to sleep on the stones themselves. None of it was accurate, but accuracy was never the point of that kind of talk. What she had actually done was considerably more deliberate and considerably less dramatic from the outside. Inside the cabin, she had positioned her slate along the south and west interior walls, the walls that received the most indirect heat from the fireplace on the north end of the room. The pieces were not mortared. They were not built into the wall structure. They leaned against the logs, stood in stacked columns 18 to 24 inches high in some places, lay flat in others, arranged with roughly half an inch of airspace between adjacent pieces and between the outermost layer and the log wall behind them. That air gap was not an oversight. It was deliberate. Air is a poor conductor of heat, which means a thin layer of it acts as a partial buffer, slowing the rate at which heat transfers from the stone into the log wall and escapes outward. The stone would absorb heat from the fire and from the room's warm air. It would release that heat back into the room slowly. The log wall behind it would receive less of that heat, meaning less would be lost to the exterior cold. The system was simple. It was also quietly elegant. From the outside, again, nothing looked different. That was what unsettled Boone the most when he finally stepped inside at her invitation, sometime in September. He had braced himself for the interior of a madwoman's project. What he found was a tidy room with a lot of dark flat rocks along two walls. He stood there looking at it for a moment. "You think that's going to keep you warm?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I think it already does," she said. "In summer, the walls stay cooler longer. Watch what happens in January." He left without much to say. On the walk home, he told himself she would freeze. Not out of cruelty. He genuinely believed it. The rocks weren't connected to anything. There was no additional insulation. She hadn't thickened the walls or added a second layer of chinking. From every angle he could evaluate with the knowledge he had, she had done a great deal of hauling to accomplish essentially nothing. That October, the settlement's informal social gathering, a quarterly exchange held at the Boone property, where families traded preserved goods and caught up on news, became the occasion for a joke that would be repeated several times over the following weeks. Someone had heard Margaret's explanation of the stones and rendered it back in the most unflattering way possible. "She thinks rocks are going to love her back." The room laughed. Even some of the women laughed, which was noted. Margaret was not present. She was at home, feeding a moderate fire in the early evening, watching the flat, dark stones along her south wall begin to deepen in color as their surface temperature climbed. She was not thinking about the laughter she couldn't hear. She was thinking about January. She had a theory, and January would settle it one way or the other. She added one more piece of split oak to the firebox, adjusted the damper, and went to bed earlier than she needed to. The stones would work through the night without her. There's a version of this story that credits Margaret Colvin with an accidental discovery. That version is wrong. What she did was not accidental. It was observational. It was the result of 2 winters spent paying close attention to something most people in her community had long since stopped questioning: the behavior of heat inside an enclosed space, and the relationship between that behavior and the materials surrounding it. She had noticed, for instance, that the hearthstone at the base of her fireplace, a broad, flat slab of the same dark river rock she would later bring inside in quantity, was still warm to the touch 8 hours after the last fire had gone out. She had noticed that the iron stove plate, by contrast, was cold within 2 hours of the fire dying. Same fire, same room, completely different behavior. The iron gave up its heat quickly and completely. The stone gave it up slowly and partially, as if reluctant to let it go. She didn't know the word thermal mass. She didn't need it. She understood the phenomenon directly. Some materials are deep buckets for heat, and some are shallow ones. A shallow bucket fills fast and empties fast. A deep bucket takes longer to fill, but it holds and it gives back over time. The physics behind what she observed is real and well documented. Dense materials like stone, brick, and fired clay have high thermal mass, meaning they can absorb and store large quantities of heat energy without their surface temperature rising dramatically. When exposed to a heat source like a wood fire, they absorb energy continuously throughout the burning period. When the fire stops, they don't go cold. They begin releasing that stored energy back into the surrounding space as radiant heat, the same mechanism by which the sun warms your skin even on a cold, clear day. The rate of release is gradual. A well-loaded mass of dense slate, say 600 to 800 pounds arranged within 4 to 6 feet of a functioning firebox, can continue to radiate measurable warmth for 6 to 12 hours after the fire is extinguished, depending on how thoroughly it was charged during the burn and how cold the surrounding environment is. This is not an estimate pulled from theory. It is a range consistent with the behavior of thermal mass materials documented in passive solar and vernacular architecture studies across multiple climates. For Margaret, the practical implication was clear. If she could get enough stone close enough to the fire during the burning hours, which ran, in her routine, from roughly late afternoon through early evening, that stone would continue heating the room from approximately 9 p.m. through 5 or 6 a.m., through the whole of the dangerous night, without a single additional piece of wood. The fire was an event. The stone was a process. She was not trying to make the fire bigger or longer. She was trying to extend its consequences beyond its own existence. This distinction between the fire as the sole heat source and the room itself as a participant in warming is one that most frontier cabin builders never made. Their instinct was always toward the fire. More wood, bigger firebox, better draft. Margaret's instinct had moved past the fire entirely toward what surrounded it. That shift in thinking was, in every practical sense, the difference between her cabin and every other one in the settlement. There was also a secondary effect she had noticed and deliberately used. The position of a stone relative to the firebox influenced how evenly the room warmed. Stone placed along the south and west walls, where cold air tended to settle and draft along the floor in winter, absorbed both the direct radiant heat from the firebox and the convective heat circulating through the room's air. When that air cooled and sank toward the floor, it was met not by cold log walls that would chill it further, but by warm stone that stabilized its temperature before it reached the ground. The drafts that had made her ankles ache in the first 2 winters became, gradually, less cutting. Not gone, but tamed. She had not designed this from a diagram. She had felt it, moved stone around in response to what she felt, and arrived at a configuration that worked. That is not a lesser form of engineering. In many ways, it is the purest form. The phrase wall within a wall is not one Margaret would have used, but it is an accurate description of what she created across the south and west interior faces of her cabin that summer and early fall. The external log walls remained untouched. She had no intention and no means of modifying the structural shell of the building. What she built was entirely interior, entirely removable in theory, and entirely invisible from the outside. A secondary thermal layer, freestanding, positioned roughly 3 to 5 inches away from the interior log surface. The specific arrangement varied by wall section, but the underlying logic was consistent throughout. Along the west wall, where the afternoon sun struck the exterior logs in summer and where prevailing winter winds delivered their worst cold in the deep months, she stacked her heaviest pieces, slabs averaging 20 to 25 pounds, stood on edge or laid flat in 2 to 3 horizontal courses reaching approximately 20 inches high. Behind each stack, between the stone and the log wall, she maintained that deliberate air gap, roughly half an inch to an inch of open space. This was not sloppiness. She had tested the difference between stone placed flush against the wall and stone held slightly away. The slightly spaced arrangement kept the wall logs drier and cooler to the touch, which told her the heat was staying in the room rather than migrating outward. Along the south wall, the shorter wall of the 16 by 18-foot room, she placed flatter, thinner pieces in a more continuous arrangement, essentially a low shelf of stone running most of the wall's length at floor level, with additional pieces stacked behind and above in a staggered pattern. This section caught both radiant heat from the fireplace across the room and the convective warmth that circulated along the south face during sustained burns. Local oral accounts suggest this was also the warmest section of the floor during cold nights, which Margaret apparently used to her advantage by positioning her sleeping area close to it. She did not place stone along the north wall, where the fireplace itself was located. This was deliberate. The fireplace's firebox and surrounding stonework already constituted thermal mass. Original construction had included a substantial rubble stone surround that extended from floor to mantel height. Adding more stone there would have been redundant and would have partially blocked the convective flow from the firebox into the room. She left the north wall as it was. She also left the east wall, where the single door was located, largely clear of stone, both for practical access reasons and because the door itself was the primary air infiltration point. Loading stone near a drafty door would have meant exposing high-mass material to cold air pulses every time the door opened, which would have stripped heat from the stone faster than the fire could replace it. By keeping the eastern face clear, she preserved the stone's charge on the other three walls, letting them work undisturbed through the night. The total configuration, when complete, gave her somewhere between 650 and 900 pounds of positioned thermal mass, a secondary skin of stone that faced inward toward the fire and the room's warm air, absorbed throughout the burn cycle, and discharged through the cold hours in a slow, radiant release that no log wall or plank floor could replicate. The closest modern equivalent is a passive solar trombe wall, a dark, dense masonry surface positioned to absorb solar energy during the day and release it as radiant heat at night. Margaret built hers with a wood fire instead of sunlight, and with river slate instead of poured concrete. The principle is identical. The physics does not care about the century. What is perhaps most remarkable is the restraint of the design. She did not fill the room with stone. She did not make the cabin difficult to move through or live in. The arrangement was proportional. Enough mass to store a full evening's worth of fire heat and release it through the night. No more. She understood, through observation, that beyond a certain threshold more stone would simply slow the charging process without meaningfully extending the discharge. She was optimizing, not accumulating. That is the mark of someone who has thought carefully about a problem, not someone who has stumbled onto a partial solution. When Elias Boone stepped inside that September afternoon and saw the rocks along the walls, he saw clutter. What he was actually looking at was a heating system. He just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. October arrived in the Tennessee Valley the way it sometimes does, not gradually, but all at once. A warm, dry September ended on a Tuesday, and by Thursday night, a line of cold air had pushed down from the northwest and settled into the hollows like something that intended to stay. The first hard freeze of the season came 2 weeks earlier than anyone had expected. Margaret had been waiting for it, not with dread, with a kind of focused attention that she had been building toward since the first Slate piece came through her cabin door. She had spent the warm months positioning, adjusting, observing. She had run small tests during the cool September nights, noting how long the stone stayed warm after a modest fire, where the heat concentrated, which sections of the wall gave back more slowly and which discharged quickly. By the time the first real cold arrived, she understood her system the way a careful carpenter understands a tool, not theoretically, but through the hands. Her routine that first October cold night was deliberate and unhurried. She began feeding the fire at roughly 4 in the afternoon, earlier than strictly necessary, with the specific intention of giving the Slate as many charging hours as possible before she let the fire fall. She used split oak, dense, slow-burning, high in BTU output per cord, and fed it steadily rather than in large loads, maintaining a sustained, moderate burn rather than a hot, roaring fire that would spike the firebox temperature and then crash. The goal was not maximum flame. It was maximum duration of consistent heat output. She wanted the stone to absorb evenly and deeply, not to be blasted on the surface while the interior of each slab stayed cold. For approximately 4 hours, the fire burned at a steady, working pace. The Slate along the south and west walls darkened noticeably as their surface temperatures climbed. If she had been able to measure them, she had no thermometer, but her hand could feel the difference clearly. The surface of the more heavily loaded sections would have reached between 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 110 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the charging period. warm enough to radiate meaningfully, cool enough to touch without discomfort. At around 8 in the evening, she let the fire begin to fall. Not by neglect, by choice. She added no more wood. She partially closed the damper to slow the draw, preserving the remaining heat in the firebox rather than pulling it up the chimney. As the fire reduced to coals, the room's air temperature, which had climbed to a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the burn, began to drop, but slowly. The stone was now the dominant heat source in the room, not the firebox. The walls. By 10 p.m., the coals were nearly gone. The room was dark except for a faint orange glow for the firebox vent. The air temperature had settled to approximately 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 to 6 degrees below its peak, but still entirely livable. Still far warmer than the outside air, which had dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit by then, with a wind that pushed the effective chill lower. She went to sleep. 300 yards away, Elias Boone was awake, feeding his third load of wood into the stove since supper. His cabin was running through its typical night cycle, roaring warm while the fire burned, sliding cold within an hour of the fire dying, forcing him or his wife up twice before dawn to keep the room from dropping below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. His walls gave nothing back. They never had. He had never expected them to. He didn't know, that night, that the woman he had written off in September was sleeping soundly under a single blanket while his own family rotated fire duty in shifts. He would find out. January would make it impossible to miss. There was one thermometer in the settlement that anyone trusted. It belonged to a man named Cyrus Aldridge, a former apothecary's assistant from Western Virginia who had arrived in the valley in the late 1860s and kept the instrument hanging inside his dry goods shed with the careful reverence of a man who understood what it represented. The thermometer was a simple mercury column housed in a tin frame, calibrated in Fahrenheit, accurate to within 2 or 3 degrees by any reasonable standard of the period. Cyrus used it to track weather patterns and, more practically, to know when to worry about his root cellar. By November, word of Margaret's sleeping through cold nights had quietly circulated enough that Cyrus became curious. He was not a man given to mockery. He was a man given to measurement. The two dispositions are different in every important way, and that difference is what put him at Margaret's door on a Thursday morning in late November, thermometer wrapped in cloth and tucked under his arm. He explained that he wanted to take readings. Both cabins, his as a baseline, Margaret's as a subject. He would record interior temperature at 3 points in the evening, when the fire was active, 2 hours after the fire was banked, and at first light the following morning. He would do the same at his own cabin under identical fire conditions. Same with species, split oak, same load, same burn duration. He presented this to Margaret with the measured courtesy of a man who had learned that careful observation requires the cooperation of those being observed. She agreed without hesitation. She had been waiting, in some form, for exactly this. The test ran across 2 consecutive nights in late November, when outdoor temperatures dropped reliably into the low 20s degree F by midnight. The protocol, as described in a brief written account Cyrus apparently kept, and which was referenced in a later regional historical digest, was straightforward. Both fires lit at 4 p.m., fed consistently until 8 p.m., then banked and left to fall naturally. Interior readings taken at 8 p.m., 10 p.m., and 6 a.m. The 8 p.m. readings were nearly identical. Both cabins had reached 66 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees Fahrenheit during active burning. There was no meaningful difference at the peak. The fires were doing what fires do, and the rooms responded similarly in the short term. The 10 p.m. readings diverged. Cyrus's cabin had dropped to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Margaret's read 61 degrees Fahrenheit, a 7-degree difference, 2 hours after the last log. Significant, but not yet dramatic. The 6 a.m. readings were what silenced the settlement. Cyrus's cabin, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. He had woken twice in the night to add wood, and the temperature had still fallen to a level where breath was visible and water in the pitcher on the table had developed a skin of ice. Margaret's cabin, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. She had not woken once. No additional wood. The fire had been cold for 10 hours. The room was nearly 20 degrees warmer than his, and nearly 30 degrees warmer than the outdoor air, which had reached 27 degrees Fahrenheit before dawn. Cyrus wrote the numbers down twice, as if checking them against themselves. Then he sat in his coat on the edge of her hearth for a long moment before he said anything. What he said, according to the account, was, "The wall is doing the work." Margaret said, "It has been since October." He asked how long she had known it would work like this. She said she hadn't known. She had suspected. There was a difference, she told him, between knowing and being willing to act on what you suspected. Most people waited for certainty. She had acted on observation and let the winter confirm it. Cyrus brought the numbers to the Trading Post the following Saturday. He read them aloud. The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has shifted and no one has decided yet how to respond. The man who had made the joke about rocks loving her back said nothing at all. He stared at his boots for a long time. Nobody laughed. January came with its full authority. The storm that arrived in the second week of the month was not the kind of cold snap the valley typically prepared for. It was the kind that rewrites a community's relationship with winter, the kind that gets a name in local memory, referred to for decades afterward simply as the hard January or the year the creek froze solid to the bottom. Oral accounts from the region, recounted in a county history compiled in the early 1900s, described 3 consecutive days of temperatures that did not rise above 11 degrees Fahrenheit even at midday, with winds out of the northwest that dropped the effective chill well below zero. Snow fell without stopping for 36 hours, accumulating to depths that made travel between homesteads nearly impossible. The valley was sealed. The settlements with supply had not been calculated for this. Most families were burning between a cord and a half per month through a normal January. This January was not normal. Within the first 48 hours, 2 families had burned through their entire remaining supply for the month and were beginning to consume split what they had set aside for spring fencing. One family, whose patriarch had been ill through the fall and had not fully completed the woodpile before the cold hit, burned furniture by the second night. A chair first, then a small table, then the board from an interior partition wall. Across the settlement, the pattern was the same. Fire in, heat out, cold back in. The cycle that Elias Boone's cabin ran every single night, all winter, simply accelerated under the weight of extreme cold. More fire required meant more wood consumed meant shorter reserves. The math was merciless and it ran in one direction. Margaret's cabin ran a different equation. She had entered January with just under 2.5 cords of split oak, roughly the same starting supply as her neighbors. Her charging routine was by now fully practiced. Fire from mid-afternoon to early evening, steady burn with split oak, banked at 8 p.m., damper partially closed. The Slate, fully integrated into the room's thermal behavior after 3 months of daily cycling, was operating at its most efficient. The stone had been heat-cycled enough times that it had stabilized. No new cracking, no moisture issues, surfaces darkened and slightly roughened from repeated thermal expansion and contraction in a way that actually increased their radiating surface area fractionally. On the first night of the hard January, with outdoor temperatures at 9 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind driving hard against the west wall, Margaret banked her fire at the usual time. The stone surfaces registered, by hand, as hot to the approach, somewhere she estimated between 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 115 degrees Fahrenheit at the peak sections near the west wall. She went to sleep. At 4 a.m., the room stood at 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The outdoor air was 7 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had not stopped. She added wood at 4 a.m., one reload, enough to bring the room back to 65 degrees Fahrenheit by 6 a.m., and to recharge the stone for another cycle. Total wood burned in a 24-hour period of genuine extreme cold, roughly a quarter cord. Her neighbors, fighting the same temperatures with no thermal mass and no stored heat in their walls, were burning between a third and half a cord per day to achieve inferior results. By the third day of the storm, the difference was no longer theoretical. It was visible. Families were moving between homesteads, carrying borrowed wood. Children were being taken to the 2 or 3 best-supplied households to sleep closer to the fire. The trading post was opened as a warming station for the first time anyone in the settlement could remember. No one came to Margaret's door asking for warmth. She didn't need visitors to stay warm, and her neighbors, by that point, understood something of why. But on the second evening of the storm, Elias Boone arrived at her door with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that was not quite embarrassment and not quite awe, but something in the country between the two. He asked if he could sit by her wall for a while. She opened the door without a word and moved his stool close to the south face, where the slate was deepest in its charge. He sat down, put both palms flat against the nearest slab, and held them there. The stone was warm under his hands, steadily, evenly, persistently warm. No crackle of active fire, no flame, just the slow, patient release of heat that the stone had been holding since afternoon. He sat there for the better part of an hour. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. When he finally stood to leave, he looked at the walls for a long moment. Then he said, "How much stone do you have left from the river?" She told him she had none set aside, but that the river still had plenty. He nodded once and went back out into the cold. The next morning, despite the storm, he was at the riverbank with a cart. When the hard January finally broke and the valley returned to something resembling ordinary winter cold, Cyrus Aldridge did what any careful observer would do with 3 months of data and a newly validated hypothesis. He added it up. The accounting was informal but honest. He had spoken with every household in the settlement, asking one simple question: how much did you burn between November and the end of January? The answers came back as estimates, most of them expressed in chords and fractions, cross-checked against what families had split in the fall and what they had remaining when the snow cleared. It was not a scientific survey, but it was more systematic than anything the settlement had attempted before, and the pattern it revealed was unambiguous. The average household in the settlement had burned between 3 1/4 and 3 3/4 cords of wood across those 3 months. The range reflected differences in family size, cabin size, and the severity of individual exposure on each homestead. Ridgetop cabins burned more than valley floor cabins, as expected. But across the sample, the center of the distribution was clear. Margaret Cole then had burned approximately 2 cords in the same period. The difference, somewhere between 1 1/4 and 1 3/4 cords saved over 3 months, translates in practical terms to several things simultaneously. It is roughly 6 to 8 weeks of reduced splitting labor. It is a meaningful reduction in the physical risk of running short in an extended cold event. And it is at a time when every available working hour had value measured in survival rather than convenience. An extraordinary return on an investment of summer afternoons hauling stone from a river. To frame it differently, the slate wall system that Margaret had assembled from free material, using no tools beyond her hands and judgment, had reduced her winter fuel consumption by somewhere between 35% and 45% compared to the settlement average. Under equivalent temperature conditions, in the same regional climate, using the same wood species. Cyrus recorded this figure carefully. He described it, in the account referenced earlier, as a savings that no additional cord of wood could have provided, because no cord of wood holds heat while it sleeps. That final phrase is worth pausing on. A cord of wood holds energy and potential. It is fuel, not warmth. It only delivers heat when it burns, and only for as long as it burns. The moment the fire dies, the potential is gone. Stone is different. Stone does not burn, but stone that has been charged by fire becomes, temporarily, a second fire, a slower one, a quieter one that asks nothing more of you once it is warm. You cannot buy that at a trading post. You cannot cut it from a forest. You can only build it deliberately from the right material in the right place, and then let the physics do what physics has always done. Margaret's savings were not the result of burning more efficiently or of having access to better wood. They were the result of having built a room that participated in its own heating. Every other cabin in the settlement was a passive container, a box that held heat only as long as the fire actively produced it. Her cabin was an active participant. The walls had been taught to remember warmth, and they did. There is also a compounding effect worth noting. Because Margaret burned less wood per cold event, Her supply lasted longer into the season, which meant she never experienced the dangerous psychological pressure of a dwindling woodpile during an extended storm. She never had to make the calculation that her neighbors made, whether to burn a piece of furniture, whether to let the room drop to 40 degrees Fahrenheit overnight to preserve enough wood for morning. That freedom from scarcity is not easily quantified, but it is real. In a settlement where the margin between comfort and crisis was measured in split logs and cold nights, the difference between a depleting supply and a stable one was the difference between clear decisions and desperate ones. Cyrus brought his accounting to the spring settlement gathering. He read the numbers in the same steady voice he had used in November when he had read the thermometer readings. This time, no one looked at their boots. People were asking questions before he finished. The widow with the rocks in her walls had, by that point, become a most consulted person in the settlement on the subject of winter preparation. She answered every question without impatience and without a trace of the satisfaction she might reasonably have felt. She had not done it to be right. She had done it to stay warm. The fact that the two turned out to be the same thing was simply what happens when you pay attention. Spring in the Tennessee Valley arrives with color before it arrives with warmth. The redbuds come first, then the dogwoods, and the ridgelines soften from gray to green over the course of 2 or 3 weeks in March and early April. It is a season of repair and preparation, of assessing what winter took and deciding what to rebuild before the heat of summer makes outdoor work uncomfortable. That spring, the settlement repaired something that had never been acknowledged as broken. It began with Elias Boone, who had left for the riverbank the morning after sitting beside Margaret's warm slate wall. His first load of river stone had been a modest one, perhaps 200 pounds, hauled by cart through the last of the January snow. He brought it inside, leaned it against his south wall without particular precision, and waited. The system he assembled in those first weeks was rough by any measure. Mismatched pieces, inconsistent spacing, no deliberate attention to the air gap that Margaret had maintained so carefully. But even that rough version, that first approximation, produced a result he could feel. His wife noticed before he admitted it. She told a neighbor in February that she had slept through the night for the first time since November. She hadn't connected it immediately to the rocks. She thought the weather had simply eased. Then the temperature dropped again, sharply, and she slept through that night too. The rocks were still warm at dawn. The fire had been cold since 9 o'clock the previous evening. Word spread through the natural channels of a small community. Kitchen conversations, borrowed tools returned with observations attached, the trading post on Saturday mornings. By March, for households had made their first trips to the river. By the end of April, local accounts suggest every family within reasonable hauling distance of suitable river stone had either begun collecting or was actively planning to. Margaret taught what she knew without reservation. She walked through 3 of her neighbors' cabins that spring, studying the walls and the stove positions, and offered guidance on placement with the practical specificity of someone who had made mistakes and corrected them. She told Boone's wife that the pieces behind the stove were too close to the flue pipe. They were absorbing heat meant to draft, which would reduce the fire's draw over time and create creosote problems in the chimney. She recommended moving them 18 inches to the left, where they would catch radiant heat from the firebox face without interfering with the column of rising exhaust. She told a younger homesteader named Percival that his stone was the wrong material. He had brought limestone from a dry hillside deposit rather than dense slate from the river, and pale limestone has roughly half the thermal mass per pound of the dark phyllite she used. It would work, she said, but he would need nearly twice the weight to achieve the same overnight retention. He went back to the river. She told Cyrus Aldridge, whose dry goods shed had a south-facing interior wall that received firelight from an adjacent potbelly stove all evening, that he was already sitting on an accidental version of the same system. The stone foundation wall on that side had been passively absorbing stove heat for years. If he added position slate at waist height along that wall and adjusted the stove's radiant face toward it more directly, he would see a measurable improvement in the shed's overnight temperature with no additional fuel. Cyrus, being Cyrus, immediately went looking for his thermometer. What Margaret was transmitting in these conversations was not a blueprint. It was a way of reading a room, of looking at space and understanding where heat moved, where it escaped, where it could be captured and held. That kind of reading is not complicated. It does not require formal education or specialized tools. It requires attention and a willingness to act on what attention reveals. She had learned it alone, in 2 cold winters, by sitting still and noticing. The wheelbarrows that arrived at the river that spring were carrying more than rock. They were carrying the recognition that the built environment, the walls, the floors, the materials a person chose to live among, could be either a passive container or an active partner. That the choice was available. That it had always been available to anyone with access to a river and a willingness to haul. The settlement had made that choice late, but it had made it. And the following winter, for the first time in the community's memory, no family burned furniture in January. Margaret Cole then did not know that she was repeating history. She had no access to the literature, such as it existed in the frontier settlement of the 1870s, that would have told her that the principle she had arrived at through 2 winters of observation was older than any European presence in North America. Older, in fact, than most of the civilizations whose descendants had come to settle the Tennessee Valley. The use of dense thermal mass to store fire heat and release it slowly through cold nights is one of the oldest engineering principles in human construction. It appears independently and in strikingly similar forms across cultures that had no contact with one another, which is the strongest possible evidence that it is not a cultural invention, but a physical discovery. The same cold that drove Margaret to her river drove people in dozens of other climates to the same solution. Stone remembers heat. Every culture that survived long, cold winters eventually learned this. The Kong of northern China is perhaps the oldest continuously used large-scale thermal mass heating system in the world. A raised platform of brick or stone, typically occupying a third to a half of a room's floor area, connected to the cooking fire's exhaust channel so that waste heat from cooking passes through the mass before exiting the chimney. By the time the evening meal was finished, the Kang's mass, sometimes weighing more than 2,000 pounds in a fully built family platform, had absorbed hours of cooking heat and would radiate it steadily through the night. Families slept on the Kong's surface. The floor that warmed them was the heating system itself. The Russian pesh, the massive masonry stove that dominated the main room of traditional Russian and Eastern European peasant homes, operated on the same logic scale differently. A well-built pesh could weigh between 2,500 and 4,000 pounds. It was fired intensely once or twice a day with fast-burning birch or pine, and the heat of those burns was absorbed into its enormous brick and clay mass. The firebox temperature during a burn might reach 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to complete combustion efficiently and charge the mass deeply. After the fire went out, the pesh would radiate warmth at roughly 130 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface for 12 to 24 hours. In a Russian winter that regularly reached minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, this was not a luxury. It was the difference between a family that survived and one that did not. The airori of traditional Japanese farmhouses, a sunken central hearth cut into the floor, distributed heat through the room at floor level, where human bodies and the cold of stone foundations met. The heavy clay and timber construction of the Minka farmhouse absorbed heat from the airori over the course of an evening and released it slowly through the night, with the thatched roof providing an additional layer of insulation above and the earthen floor providing a degree of ground-coupled thermal stability below. In the American Southwest, the ancient Puebloan peoples built stone and adobe structures whose thermal mass was so well understood that the orientation and wall thickness of individual rooms was very deliberately based on use. Sleeping rooms on the south and east to absorb winter sun through the day, storage rooms on the north where stable, cool temperatures were needed year-round. The material, adobe, a mixture of clay, sand, and straw, has a specific heat capacity and density very close to the river slate Margaret was using. The physics is the same. The millennia between the construction dates do not change the physics. None of these traditions invented the principle. All of them discovered it. They discovered it the same way Margaret discovered it, by living in cold places, paying attention, and following what the materials themselves revealed. What makes Margaret's story distinctive is not the originality of the discovery. It is the precision of the rediscovery. Working alone, without access to any of these traditions, in a cultural context that offered her neither encouragement nor precedent, she arrived at the correct answer through nothing more than observation and the willingness to act on what she saw. She got the material selection right. She got the placement right. She got the air gap right. She got the charging routine right. Her independent derivation aligned, in its essential elements, with engineering traditions refined over thousands of years on the other side of the world. That alignment is not coincidence. It is evidence of something more fundamental, that when human beings encounter the same physical problem in the same physical environment, with enough attention and enough time, they tend to converge on the same physical answer. The river Slate in a Tennessee Valley cabin and the fired brick of a Russian Pesh are made of different materials and separated by 10,000 miles. But they were doing the same work. They had always been doing the same work. Margaret just had to find her way back to it. Walk through the framing of a new house being built today. Any house in any American suburb or rural development at any price point, and look at what the walls are made of. On the exterior, likely engineered wood sheathing, perhaps an inch thick, a layer of house wrap, vinyl or fiber cement siding. On the interior, half-inch drywall over 2x4 or 2x6 lumber studs set 16 inches apart, with a cavity packed with fiberglass or mineral wool insulation. It is a well-understood system, inexpensive to build, and adequate at its primary task, slowing the rate at which heat moves through the wall assembly from inside to outside. But there is something this system does not do. It does not store heat. It does not remember warmth. It has, by any reasonable measurement, almost no thermal mass. Drywall, gypsum sandwiched between paper, has a specific heat capacity and density that gives it negligible heat storage capacity relative to its surface area. A typical interior wall in a modern American home, the full assembly from stud to stud face, holds the thermal equivalent of a thin sheet of cardboard wrapped around a column of trapped air. When the furnace runs and the room reaches 70 degrees Fahrenheit, the walls climb to 70 degrees Fahrenheit with it. When the furnace stops, the walls offer back almost nothing. They are thermometers, not batteries. They record the temperature of the room. They do not defend it. This is why modern forced air heating systems cycle the way they do, running the furnace until the air temperature reaches the thermostat's set point, then shutting off, then running again when the air temperature drops, then shutting off again. The room swings between approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 72 degrees Fahrenheit in a continuous oscillation, with the furnace acting as a reactive correction mechanism rather than a stored energy system. The walls play no role in this cycle except to lose heat to the exterior at whatever rate their insulation permits. The efficiency loss in this model is real and measurable. Studies of residential heating in comparable climates consistently show that buildings with high thermal mass, thick masonry walls, stone or brick interior surfaces, concrete slab floors, maintain more stable interior temperatures with less total energy input than lightweight wood frame construction of equivalent insulation value. The mass acts as a buffer, absorbing excess heat when the room is warm and releasing it when the room cools, smoothing the peaks and valleys that force reactive heating systems to work harder than they need to. This is not a new discovery. It is a principle that was well understood and structurally embedded in virtually every significant masonry building tradition in human history, from the stone longhouses of Iron Age Scotland to the thick adobe walls of Spanish colonial missions in the American Southwest, to the brick and plaster construction that dominated American urban architecture well into the early 20th century. These buildings were not insulated by modern standards. Some of them were drafty, moisture-prone, and difficult to heat quickly. But they were thermally stable in a way that a 2x4 wood frame house, for all its air sealing and bad insulation, fundamentally is not. The shift away from thermal mass construction in American residential building accelerated after World War II, driven by the economics of speed and material cost. Lumber was cheap and plentiful. Masonry was slow and labor-intensive. The rising availability of cheap fossil fuel made the inefficiency of lightweight construction easy to absorb. If the house bled heat overnight, you simply ran the furnace longer in the morning. The cost of that choice was invisible for decades, absorbed into utility bills that seemed manageable as long as energy prices stayed low. They did not stay low. The communities most attentive to thermal mass in contemporary construction, passive house builders, earthship designers, Adobe and rammed earth practitioners, are not working with new science. They're working with old physics. The principle that Margaret Colden rediscovered at a Tennessee river on a summer morning in the 1870s is the same principle encoded in every passive solar design standard published in the last 50 years. Put dense, dark material where it can absorb heat during warm periods and let it release that heat slowly during cold ones. The material can be concrete, adobe, rammed earth, brick, or river slate carried uphill in a hand-pulled cart. The physics does not distinguish between them. What the modern building industry forgot, or perhaps set aside in the name of speed and standardization, is that a room can be taught to hold its warmth, that the walls themselves can participate in the thermal life of a building rather than simply containing it, that the difference between a house that fights the cold all night and one that rests through it is not insulation value or furnace output. It is mass. It is the willingness to build heavy, to build dark, to build with materials that remember what fire gave them. Margaret Cole then built that way, alone, without precedent, at a river's edge, because the alternative was another winter feeding furniture into a firebox at 3 in the morning. The alternative, for a great many people today, is simply a higher utility bill. The stakes are lower now, but the principle is unchanged, and the river still has plenty of slate. There is a particular quality to the warmth that radiates from stone that has been thoroughly charged by fire. It is not the sharp, immediate heat of an open flame, nor the dry, forceful warmth of a modern furnace vent pushing air across a room. It is something quieter than both of those. It comes from a surface that does not flicker. It does not pulse or cycle. It simply gives, steadily, evenly, without urgency, the way that deep things give when they've been asked to hold something for a long time and are finally ready to let it go. Anyone who has sat beside a well-built masonry heater in the hours after its fire has gone cold knows this quality without needing it described. It is warmth that feels earned rather than manufactured. Warmth that the material has genuinely stored and is genuinely releasing, not warmth that a machine is producing and injecting into the air on a timed interval. There is a physical difference, measurable in BTUs per square foot per hour of radiant emission. There's also a felt difference that the numbers capture imperfectly, the sense of being warmed by something that was itself warm, rather than being heated by something that was engineered to produce heat on demand. Margaret Colvin's cabin did not survive. Oral account from the county place its eventual deterioration sometime in the 1890s, after it had stood vacant for several years following her death. The logs returned to the earth, as logs do. The fireplace stone was likely salvaged for other construction, as useful stone always was on the frontier. What remained, for a time, was the slate, scattered at the site, moved and res-tacked in different configurations by whoever occupied the land afterward, eventually dispersed by weather and time into the surrounding ground. The river, which had given it, took nothing back. Stone doesn't dissolve. It simply relocates. What survived completely was the knowledge. Cyrus Aldridge's written account, the brief document referenced throughout this story, housed according to a regional historical digest in a county archive whose name has been rendered inconsistently across sources, preserves the temperature readings, the wood consumption figures, and a passage that describes Margaret's explanation of the air gap between stone and wall in terms precise enough to suggest she had thought about it carefully and communicated it carefully. Whether that document remains accessible today is uncertain, but the information it contained had already moved, by the time it was written, into the behavior of a community. It was encoded not in paper, but in practice, in the stone along a dozen cabin walls, in the habits of families who had learned to start their fires early and let the walls do the night work. That is how most of the knowledge that kept people alive on the American frontier actually traveled. Not in books, not in formal instruction, in observation and demonstration, and the quiet transmission of one person showing another what they had worked out through necessity. The frontier was, among other things, an enormous distributed laboratory. Millions of experiments running simultaneously, most of them unrecorded, all of them subject to the merciless peer review of winter. What worked, people taught. What didn't work, people quietly stopped doing. The knowledge that survived that process had a quality that academic knowledge does not always have. It had been tested under conditions where failure was not an acceptable outcome. Margaret's system passed that test. It passed it in the hardest January anyone in the valley had seen in a generation, without preparation and without assistance, in the cabin of a woman whom the community had already written off as peculiar. That is about as rigorous a validation as vernacular engineering ever receives. It is worth sitting with the specific details of what she did, because they are replicable by anyone with access to a river, a cart, and a room with a heat source. Dense, dark stone, slate, basalt, dense sandstone, fired brick, positioned along the walls that face the heat source, held slightly away from the structural surface, loaded during a sustained moderate burn in the late afternoon and early evening, and left to discharge through the night. No mortar, no modification to the building structure, no tools beyond judgment and hands. The material cost, in her case, was zero. The labor cost was significant, but it was summer labor, invested once, that paid dividends through every subsequent winter for as long as the stone remained in place. Stone does not wear out as a thermal mass. It does not degrade, compress, or lose its specific heat capacity over time. The same slabs that Margaret carried from the river in the summer of her third year in that cabin would have been doing the same work 30 years later, had the cabin stood. They were not a repair or an upgrade. They were a permanent alteration of the cabin's thermal character, a change to what the room itself was capable of, built into the material reality of the walls rather than dependent on any technology, supply chain, or ongoing cost. That permanence is part of what makes the contrast with modern construction so striking. A modern furnace has a service life of 15 to 25 years before its efficiency degrades or its components fail. A programmable thermostat is obsolete within a decade. The insulation in a wood frame wall retains its rated R value for decades under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions, no moisture intrusion, no settling, no pest damage, are not what walls actually experience. The systems that modern homes depend on for warmth are, almost without exception, temporary. They will be replaced. They will be upgraded. They will fail at inconvenient moments. They require energy from an external source, delivered through infrastructure that can be interrupted. A wall of river slate positioned beside a wood stove requires none of those things. It requires only fire, which any person with access to wood can make, and the patience to let the stone charge before the night arrives. It is not a primitive solution to a heating problem. It is a mature solution arrived at by independent reasoning across dozens of cultures and thousands of years that asks nothing of external systems because it builds the system into the room itself. Margaret understood this without the language to say it in the terms we would use today. She understood it the way all genuine engineering knowledge is first understood, through direct contact with the problem, careful attention to the evidence, and the willingness to stake something real on what the evidence suggested. She staked 2 winters of cold and discomfort and 1 summer of heavy labor on her observation that dark stone stayed warm longer than iron. She was right. The stone told her so, and it kept telling the room so, all through every subsequent night, until the cabin was gone and the slate was back at the river's edge, still carrying the same properties it had always carried, waiting for the next person who needed to know what stone remembers when fire asks it to hold. The river hasn't changed. The physics hasn't changed. The cold hasn't changed. What changed for one settlement in a Tennessee valley in the winter of the 1870s was the willingness to listen to a woman who had paid attention. That willingness is still available. It always has been. This story is presented as educational and historical content, reconstructed from plausible accounts of vernacular building practices of the period. It is not a substitute for professional engineering guidance. Any structural modifications to a home's heating system should be reviewed by qualified professionals.